Hello, everyone. Welcome to season 4, episode 1 of the Trading Without Borders podcast. Today, we are examining the realities of trade facilitation across Africa and taking a close look at the on-ground experiences of clearing goods at African borders. From delays and excessive paperwork to informal fees and human stories behind them, we will explore the complex challenges that shape trade across the continent. We will examine how these border inefficiencies impact delivery times, increase spoilage and cost, and weaken overall supply chain performance. And we'll also discuss the broader implications of how inefficient border processes affect trade and investment flows and offer practical recommendations for building a more seamless and efficient trading environment. According to the WTO, efficient trade is a cornerstone of economic development, yet in many developing countries, complex border procedures, outdated infrastructure, and logistical bottlenecks create barriers that not only slow trade but also limit economic opportunities. The WTO further emphasizes the need to simplify and modernize imports and exports processes as a critical priority for the global trading system. Today, we are joined by a distinguished guest who will walk us through the key issues shaping trade facilitation at African borders, from logistical hurdles and cross-border movement of goods to the role of global and regional policy frameworks and sustainable solutions to support the AFCFTA implementation. Our esteemed guest today is Ziad Hamoui. Ziad is a chartered logistician, a regional integration advocate and passionate Pan-Africanist with 22 years of private sector experience in logistics and transport in Ghana and 14 years of international development expertise across West Africa. He is a founding member, past president, and current national president for Ghana Borderless Alliance, an award-winning private sector-led multi-stakeholder advocacy group that promotes regional economic integration in West Africa and tackles barriers to regional trade and transport. He is also a founding member of the Trade Facilitation Coalition for Ghana, a private sector-led grassroots level campaign to enhance trade and business in Ghana. It is therefore a great honor to have Ziad join the podcast, share insights from the perspective of a stakeholder within the trade facilitation space. Thank you so much, Ziad, for agreeing to join us today. You're welcome to the Trading Without Borders podcast.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Omovola, to you and to your listeners. And thank you for the opportunity to share our experience from advocacy from West Africa.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. So now that our introductions are done, let's go right into today's discussion. So I will be asking the first question now. So Ziad, in your publication, Addressing the Trade Facilitation Challenge in the Context of the AFCFTA Views from West Africa, you highlighted how trade and transport facilitation are essential for building strong economies and advancing regional integration. But as many traders and transporters know, the day-to-day reality that the borders often doesn't match the policy promises. From your point of view, what's the current state of affairs at the border post across West Africa, or even more broadly across the continent? Are there any tangible improvements since the time of your publication? And could you share specific examples, either positive or negative, that illustrate what has changed or what remains stuck? Thank you.
That's a great first question, but that's a big question, isn't it? So let us try to decompress it and let us go to the root, or to the beginning, actually. And I'd like us first to start by defining regional integration, because different people have different ways of interpreting that. And for me, the best definition of regional integration is the process of overcoming barriers that divide neighboring countries by common accord and of jointly managing shared resources and assets. Essentially, it is a process by which groups of countries liberalize trade, creating a common market for goods, people, capital, and services. And so this definition is very relevant for West Africa, where we have 15 member states, of which 3 landlocked and 1 island, or at least until very recently. And even more so with Africa, which has 55 member states, of which 6 islands and 16 landlocked. So regional integration is important in order to manage our resources, our laws, and the flow of people, goods, finance, and capital across these countries. So you can tell from the historical and symbolism of regional integration that the idea is to unite Africa, even though Africa itself comes from different backgrounds and from rich cultural heritages. So, and I know that one of the main problems challenging regional integration is not economic. It has to do with the meaning of border posts in Africa, which are a representation of a period where colonizers came to the continent, drew maps and lines between countries, dividing countries which originally were freely moving, whether exchanging goods or services, or moving to visit relatives. And so one of the main challenges for regional integration is to build a common narrative that pushes the Africans together. Similarly, maybe to post-World War II Europe, which found common cause in economy in order to build a more thriving and prosperous Europe. And so they started small with a few countries in a few supply chains, then expanded the number of countries, expanded the supply chains, and then reached a point where they integrated all of their countries and moved forward. So let me now jump into 3 major observations of the inter-African trade, the state of intra-African trade. The first one is a common informality. There's a lot of informal trade crossing the continent. And even though it's not recorded, it is significant. Some economists actually, some of which you have actually interviewed, some of them estimated that if the informal cross-border trade are factored into the trade of Africa, that the number of average intra-African trade would jump from the current average of 15% to around 30%. And that's not bad, actually, 30%. Keep in mind that if you look at the intra-regional merchandise trade from UNCTAD stats, according to the World Trade Statistical Review of 2023, Africa and Latin America are the 2 regions with the lowest intra-African trade. Excuse me. So Africa is not just at the bottom of the chart like this by itself. That's one. And the second is that if you include the intra-African cross-border informal trade, the numbers will increase significantly. So the case would be about how to move with the informality and to record these informal cross-border trade. The second major observation is the weak enforcement of rules and regulations across countries in Africa. And this complicates the matter because heads of states and agent governments will agree to and sign up to certain agreements, regional or continental or international. And then when they come back home, there will be a challenge with the domestication or the ratification or the enforcement of these agreements. And that comes up with a whole lot of economic costs and legal complications. And the third major observation has to do with the prevalence of road transportation across Africa, maybe as a symptom of the lack of interconnectivity across the continent itself. But up to 80% of transportation across the continent takes place by road. And that doesn't make sense at all because a continent that is so huge cannot just trade among itself using the roads. And there's always this particular point where people talk about border crossings as if they expect that all of the trade in the future of Africa to be conducted by road. There are other modes of transportation that might be more useful, and we'll get to that maybe during our conversation. But then we need to be mindful of the fact that we need to not only boost intra-African trade, but we need to build the foundation of trade, which is the logistics, to make sure that not only we can trade among ourselves, but that we can also do it in a good way. Now, connectivity is a key. And you asked me whether there were improvements or whether there are changes. And I'll tell you that there are several improvements taking place on several levels, whether on regional or national. And then continually, logistics and connectivity are becoming central in the discussion of boosting intra-African trade. At first, it was the trade and the manufacturing of goods and services, but now it has come to the fact that Africa is better connected to the rest of the world than it is to itself, of transportation services across the continent for advancing intra-African trade. And then discussing of the political will in the implementation of the various regional agreements and national laws. That in itself also is becoming a more mainstream discussion. For example, just last week, the head of the African Center of Economic Transformation was talking about the importance of political will in driving the African Continental Free Trade Area. Not just about signing and ratifying the agreement, but then comes after signing the domestication and of the local laws and regulations, so that become aligned with the continental regulations. So this is in a nutshell what I see. I see improvements. There are more and more national case stories that embed the importance, for example, of cross-border trade and procedures and harmonization and simplification of trade. And you can see that at the level, for example, of the national trade facilitation committees or the national borders which are in charge of trade facilitation. And that now more and more countries are looking at their neighbors and how to harmonize the trade flows with their African neighbors, rather than looking at their traditional network of partnerships beyond Africa. So I think all of these are positive developments and they should be encouraged, especially so because of the current rising disruptions and uncertainties and global value chain disruptions, which have amplified effects on African trade. I think it's about time for us to sit down and wake up to the fact that Africa needs to integrate to itself, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's very important for the sustainability of our trade and for the resilience that it creates. By trading among ourselves in the goods that we need, we become more self-reliant and we build the kinds of partnerships with the continent that drives economic integration forward. So I think I'll stop here for a while.
Okay. Thank you, Ziad, for that, and thank you. You've emphasized the national efforts and steps being taken by different countries in Africa in boosting trade, facilitating trade, and also the fact that there is a need for us to also boost logistics and connectivity for us to connect for deeper regional integration. So I will move on to the next question now. So my next question is, the World Customs Organization guidelines on trade facilitation emphasize the importance of making comprehensive, up-to-date information on customs procedures and other trade-related matters publicly available. In your publication, you highlighted the lack of accessible information at border posts as a major challenge, including the absence of information desk and the limited knowledge among custom officials, police, and other relevant agencies about border crossing rules. To what extent have African countries implemented these WCO guidelines at their ports and border posts? Would you say there's been significant progress across the continent, or is this still a major gap? And looking at a bigger picture with the implementation of the AfCFTA, what do you think the long-term impact of these information gaps could be on the success of the AfCFTA?
So before I answer this particular question, let me first disambiguate so that I will not be called later on by my friends from GRA or the police or immigration to ask me why I think they're not doing their jobs. And so To be more specific, the study touched upon the fact that some of the uniformed authorities are not very sure, not about the national laws, but about the regional rules and regulations which need to apply to the cross-border trade. And sometimes it happens not in a particular country, but and it's caused by the rapid turnover and changes of personnel across the borders, knowing that, as you know, the borders in Africa are too wide, far and wide. So you need to rotate your personnel along. So this is just a small clarification. But I agree, the WCO guidelines are very critical in the areas of highlighting the transparency, importance, the predictability, the simplification and harmonization of cross-border trade procedures. And in fact, the revised Kyoto Convention of 1999 remains a cornerstone in defining the trade facilitation requirements of nations. And it is an important building block on which later on the World Trade Organization came up with the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And it was also one of the main reference documents for the African Continental Free Trade Agreements Areas Agreement. But where the WCO falls short is in being helpful for informal cross-border trade. And the idea with the AFCFTA is to increase and to boost intra-African trade. And to do that, you have to do two things. The first is to simplify the form of cross-border trade, but the second is to also somehow acknowledge, formalize, and to increase the small-scale cross-border trade and informal cross-border trade that is taking place frequently. So with these, harmonization is still a long way because different countries have different rules and regulations with regard to the simplified trade regimes that will be required for this small scale of operations. And then comes the fact that the alignment between the implementation of the national rules and regulations needs to be taken into consideration against the regional economic communities and then against the AFCFTA. So in other words, you have a national law in the country, you are part of a regional economic community, so you have to align with them with these laws. And then these two have to also align with the AFCFTA, since, as you know, the AFCFTA uses the RECs as its building blocks. And that is a bit of a gray area because even though the RECs themselves are the AFCFTA's building blocks, but then they have to align their rules with those of the Continental Agreement. And so all of this to say that harmonization is still a long way, but it's going in the right path. And for example, for the AFCFTA, you might be aware of the protocol on women and youth, which has been recently added to the rest of the protocols which have been discussed. The protocol on trade goods, protocol of trade and services, intellectual property rights, investment, and the others. So the protocol on women and youth, for example, is an addition to factor into consideration the needs of the marginalized traders and economic operators and how to connect them into the continental trade network. So all of these are very good, and they give you a clear roadmap about how to move in order to enhance your transparency, predictability, simplification, and harmonization of cross-border trade. Because now you have the requirements there, but then you have to build the capacity of the smaller traders, and then you have to build the knowledge base of the larger economic operators. And all of this takes time and resources and a lot of sensitization.
Thank you very much for that. And also, thank you for clarifying that most of the border officials, even though they are clear about national regulations, it's regional rules that they are not clear about. So I think there needs to be some capacity building and awareness. More training needs to be done for them as well. And I can see you're really passionate about our informal cross-border trade and the need to acknowledge and bringing them within the formal trade system. So moving on to the third question, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, aims to boost intra-African trade through the development of transformative infrastructure across the continent. And it is reported that some progress has been made so far in achieving these objectives. In your publication, you pointed out that inadequate border infrastructure remains a major barrier as it continues to fuel friction in the cross-border movement of goods. From your perspective, are we seeing real improvements at key border posts, or do the infrastructure gaps still pose a serious challenge to trade under the AFCFTA? So that's the next question for you, Ziad.
Yeah, thank you. I think PIDA is very important as we examine the information gap to connect Africa to itself. Obviously, there is a very large infrastructure gap, and sadly, that gap is widening instead of closing for various reasons. Something has to be done by that, for that. But keep in mind that the hard infrastructure are not the only part of the infrastructure that needs to be addressed. So yes, roads and ports and airports are very important, but also you need to look at the role of soft infrastructure, which is key. And here we're talking about the governance aspects, the accountability, the capacity building, and all of these. So, and this is especially important for landlocked and least developed countries and small islands, because for a small island, what would the hard infrastructure be? You need seaports. But then if your seaport is there and you cannot integrate and access your African markets adequately, what do? For example, one of the reasons why maritime intra-African trade is so difficult and complex, for example, that if you are shipping a product, let's say from Ghana to Nigeria, that's less than 800 kilometers difference. The goods that the ship will have to go to Europe and transit there before coming back to Nigeria. That's incredible. And the only reason we have this kind of difficulties with the connectivity of our continent is because we do not have a clear continental framework for short sea shipping, which allows us to address the aspects of liberalization of transportation of maritime transportation services for various reasons. And so this is why I'm saying that, yes, PIDA is important, but if we build the best infrastructure and you forget to complement it with the soft infrastructure, then you might as well end up with the same bottlenecks and choke points, which will reduce your trade, increase your trade time, and will increase the cost of doing business. Because remember, the objective is not just to connect the continent to itself, but also to do that competitively, cost effectively, and to the interest of all of the economic operators involved. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as much as we are addressing hard infrastructure, it is also important to complement that with soft infrastructure. So both need to be addressed for us, for intra-Africa trade, for effective trade facilitation. So I'll then move on to the next question. We are going to look at the ripple effects of border inefficiencies, the delays, and the increased cost, the unpredictability as well. From your experience, how are these challenges affecting supply chains, trade, and logistics across the continent? What toll do these border inefficiencies take on traders, drivers, and informal cross-border operators? And more broadly, what impact are they having on Africa's push for deeper regional integration under the AFCFTA? How much time is typically lost due to inefficient processes, and what are the consequences for traders and transporters? Thank you.
So, you might have heard it many times before that transport and trade across Africa is among the most expensive in the entire world, and for various reasons. Because of our inability to connect our markets and to cross border effectively, we end up with longer time for crossings, we end up with higher costs at the points of entries, along the corridors, and at the border crossings. But what aggravates the matters further, you've been talking about statistics. We can talk about numbers of days that are spent on average between, let's say, Burkina Faso and Ghana, or the number of days that economic operators were waiting at the Benin border during the Benin-Nigeria saga, which you remember a few years ago, for crossing because of the transit fees issues. So, but here's the thing, you will notice that we are very short of meaningful data about the amount of time and trades that cross across our borders. And this particular issue is very significant on two levels. The first, for a policymaker, if you don't really know what are the volumes of trade, the number of vehicles crossing and people crossing, and if you don't have that for decision making, then you will definitely end up making wrong decisions, because because the availability of data is a key requirement for making good decisions. And so a few years ago actually, Borderless Alliance, in partnership with the USAID, were collaborating on the dissemination of the findings from what we call the road governance maps. And these maps were simply quarterly collection. They were collections of the amount of time and money and the number of checkpoints that the cross-border traders across West Africa were engaged in. So basically, on every quarter, the collectors will collect these sheets from the drivers who have been moving their trucks across West Africa, and they will minutely record the number of checkpoints, the amount of times they spent at these checkpoints, and then the amount of extortion fees that they paid. And then we publish these maps on quarterly basis along many of the major corridors along West Africa. And then this would be a way to compare the progress on road governance in West Africa. But unfortunately, for a few years' time now, this work has been discontinued because of sustainability issues, and then because of governance issues in the relationship between USAID and the regional economic community which they were working with, which was UEMWA and ECOWAS. So as it stands, we do have a serious case of absence of meaningful data across borders, but we do know that overall drivers spent unnecessarily numbers of days beyond the required number of days from just traveling along these corridors. And we haven't even mentioned yet the checkpoints, the number of checkpoints that are along these roads. So, for example, from Tema in Ghana to Paga at the border between Ghana and Burkina Faso, the latest statistics from a few months ago by a fact-finding mission from Ghana Shippers Authority mentioned 69 road checkpoints. 69. We're still in Ghana to get from Tema to Paga. So if you're coming back, there are 69 others. That's a lot. And this means that there are, and many of these checkpoints, the significance is that when you stop, there will be attempts for extorting illicit fees from some of the economic drivers. And coupled to the fact that in most of the times, economic operators do not adequately brief their transport operators on the requirements for the rules and regulations for their vehicles and for their drivers. You end up having a lot of illicit fees and unnecessary waste of time and resources along the corridors. So it is very unfortunate, but it will take a lot of sensitization, and hopefully we'll find a way with development in the age of scarcity to mobilize the kinds of revenues and resources required to establish these kinds of border observatories, where you can record the average times for crossing, the average costs, and all of the information that is critical to find out exactly what is going on along our borders. whether West Africa or beyond.
Okay, thank you for that, and I hope that we are able to put into effect some of what you have recommended, and a lot of sensitization should also go on as well. So the next question, with the AfCFTA aiming to streamline and simplify trade across borders, what are the biggest gaps that still need to be addressed? Are there any efforts you are aware of to harmonize or digitize border procedures? If so, are they working?
Okay, I think you broke up a bit, Umabola, but...
Okay, I can repeat that.
Can you repeat?
Let me repeat that. Okay, so with the AfCFTA aiming to streamline and simplify trade across borders, what are the biggest gaps that still need to be addressed? Are there any efforts you are aware of to harmonize or digitize border procedures? If so, are they working?
All right, thank you for repeating the question. Yes, I think one of the main challenges, or it's not really a challenge, it is about the adoption of common and harmonized procedures. And you know that there are several examples across Africa where some of the region, the economic communities adopt a simplified trade regime for economic activity crossing the border below a certain threshold. And that would allow small-scale cross-border traders and economic operators to process their documentation and their goods much faster and more cost-effectively. But at the level of the continental trade, there isn't a particular simplified trade regime that the rest of the countries will be aligning with, which means that if, for example, within West Africa, you have, in West Africa, it's an exception because we don't have a common standard harmonized simplified trade regime. And so I think one of the main challenges is to establish the templates of simplified trade regimes at continental level that you find acceptable, and that as a country you have to agree to have that as your harmonized procedure, and then that the rest of the recs which do not have a simplified trade regime will need to adopt one so that they can also conform to the continental requirements and suggestions. And so in this case, for example, in West Africa, I think I know that ECOWAS is working on a simplified trade regime, but they are not yet finalized it and they haven't started rolling it out. But for example, in Ghana, we do have what we call the headband, which means that if goods beyond a certain value are crossing the border, then there's a much simpler procedure that you use in order to declare and then to cross the border. So if we have something similar to this that gets replicated and harmonized across the rest of the recs, then we are fine, but we don't. So it's up to the recs to establish, and it's up to the continental agreement to agree that these are the template STRs that you want to use, or you are comfortable with, and that you would like countries who do not have it to adopt it. Well, I know of several different development partners who are working, for example, on a corridor approach in West Africa, on the Abidjan-Lagos corridor. You have Trademark Africa, who are working on, first of all, establishing a monitoring mechanism for the cross-border times and costs. And then we know that they are also working on looking into simplified trade regimes on a corridor basis. But since the corridor, Abidjan-Lagos, is within ECOWAS, so it can be used as a pilot in order to later on recommend it for the REC as a possible template to use. So there are some activities that are taking place and some encouraging signs. Look, I'm one of the people who truly believe in sharing and learning from across the continent. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel. And I always said, let's look for what is working in some areas and find out whether we can replicate it as it is, or we need to tweak it and twist it to our use. And if it is possible, let us just do it. Let's forget about the politics behind it. Let's just simplify the lives of our traders and economic operators. That has been the principle which I've been working on within my advocacy with Borderless Alliance. And it is my hope that governments will also realize that they are responsible to act on behalf of their citizens and their economic operators. So that is why, in the first place, Borderless Alliance was created when we identified a gap in the public-private policy engagement on behalf of the private sector. So we wanted to be a local, regional advocacy group that represents the private sector and engages on the lack of enforcement of regional rules and regulations. So these are some of the roles that we play, and these are some of the paths that we have identified that could help us move forward.
Thank you so much, Ziad. And it's a great work that the Borderless Alliance has been doing so far in trying to identify and make recommendations for how to close the gaps. And we also hope the various African governments are able to take advantage of some of this information in boosting our trade or helping to close gaps within the continent. And so my final question to you today is, so it's going to be a recommendation. So what key structural and regulatory steps should state parties take to improve efficiency for a successful trade and deeper integration within the continent? I think your last discussion flows into this.
It does, actually. Thank you. And my idea here, to answer your question, is to fall back on the publication which you so kindly referred to earlier, which was our submission to UNECA ATPC and was part of an ESC series on gender and trade, specifically about trade facilitation in the borders. And it is basically a summary of the advocacy work that we have been doing and the experiences since 2011, all wrapped up into a small publication available online. And basically, we identified 5 main challenges, which are the lack of adequate border infrastructure, the entrenched culture of gender bias, the absence of adequate information desks, the informal nature of cross-border trade, and the lack of dispute resolution. And for these main 5 challenges, we recommended as Borderless Alliance the 5 following sets of solutions. Addressing cross-border infrastructure by mobilizing the right finances to build and to deliver the border infrastructure that is critical for cross-border trade. To end gender bias in trade by working on gender mainstreaming and capacity building, especially at the borders. To redress information deficiencies by creating outlets that provide up-to-date information in real time to economic operators, by formalizing trade via enhanced trade data collection, and finally by working on integrating the dispute settlement under the AFCFTA. These are the recommendations, and the submission is available online. I could send you also the link, then you can feel free to share widely within your social media also.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I would appreciate that, so I can share the link when this has been publicized. So thank you so much, Ziad, for joining us today. Thank you for making up time out of your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. Really insightful and eye-opening. And we hope that if we call you another time, you'll be willing to join us again. And we would also like to say a very big thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And this is the first episode out of our mini series on addressing logistical challenges within the African continent. And the next subsequent episode, we would also be interviewing somebody that operates within the informal cross-border space, a logistics player, and hopefully somebody from within the rec. Let's also have somebody within the policy space also come in to share their thoughts, what are they doing and what are the challenges and how they are addressing it as well. So until the next episode, I say to you all, bye-bye.